In the autumn of 1965, the Higgins family of four, a married couple and their two young children, vanished without a trace from their cottage in Ashworth, Yorkshire. Their disappearance might have remained just another cold case in the local constabulary's files, if not for what detectives uncovered 3 months later: a concealed chamber beneath St. Mary's Church, filled with the family's personal artifacts and meticulous journal entries chronicling Church of England rituals officially outlawed centuries ago. The most unsettling detail: the final entry was dated 2 weeks after the Higgins were reported missing. For nearly 60 years, the parish refused to acknowledge the hidden room, and the cottage where the family lived stands abandoned to this day, its doors boarded and its windows staring emptily at the moor. Even more disturbing, when sealed church records were finally unsealed in 1985, investigators discovered the Higgins were not the first to vanish under these eerie circumstances. Others had disappeared from the same village, their stories lost to time. Tonight, I'll reveal what truly transpired in that quiet corner of Yorkshire, drawing on documents never before made public and testimony from the sole surviving witness, who has agreed to shatter 40 years of silence. But a warning: this channel isn't for the faint of heart. Only the bravest truth-seekers should stay. If you're ready to unearth secrets authorities tried to bury forever, hit subscribe now, and tell me in the comments which country you're watching from. Few channels dare to expose the darkness we uncover. Now let's step into the shadows of 1965 Yorkshire and discover what terror awaited in Ashworth village. What happened here would shatter every notion of that quiet, God-fearing community and expose a conspiracy of silence that hid unspeakable secrets for nearly 50 years. Ashworth was a place where time felt slow, where every stone seemed to whisper with 8 centuries of history. Tucked in the heart of the Yorkshire Dales, its 300 or so residents lived in ancient cottages, generations woven into the same narrow lanes. At its centre stood St. Mary's Church, a Norman fortress built in 1187 atop an even older Saxon shrine. Its limestone tower soared nearly 100 feet into the sky, weathered oak doors bound by iron bands groaning in the wind. That autumn brought an unnatural chill. Leaves turned crimson and gold weeks earlier than ever before, colours so vivid they looked painted. Each evening a heavy fog rolled down from the moors, curling around the churchyard like a living shroud. Villagers walking home at dusk felt the ground shift beneath their feet, as if the mist itself rearranged paths. And then the bells changed. The same bells that had tolled for centuries, invitations to worship and markers of time, now rang with a hollow, distant tone. Their once familiar peals seemed to echo from another world, warning those who listened that Ashworth's deepest horrors were only beginning. Mrs. Agnes Peaton had lived beside St. Mary's for 63 years, and she was the first to notice. The bronze bells, she swore, had taken on a deeper, almost liquid tone, as if the very air around them had grown heavy. Some nights, when the moon hid behind the clouds, she heard them tolling when no hand was in the tower, soft, mournful peals that seemed to rise from deep beneath the earth. Thomas Arthur Higgins was a man of perfect routine. At 38, he ran the village post office just as his father had before him. Every morning at 7 sharp, he stepped from his cottage on Church Lane, suit pressed, satchel in hand, and walked his children, Margaret Rose, 12, and William Thomas, 8, to school. Then he set to work sorting mail, sending telegrams across the valley. Quiet and devout, Thomas served as church warden, arranging hymnals and polishing collection plates before dawn. His faith was as solid as the Yorkshire hills themselves, steady, practical, unwavering, which makes what happened next all the more impossible. A man who trusted every stone and every prayer suddenly found himself at the centre of a mystery that would shatter everything his neighbours believed possible. Eleanor Mary Higgins, née Whitlock, had arrived in Ashworth 15 years earlier as a fresh-faced bride. Now 35, she still moved with the grace that first caught Thomas's eye at a church social in nearby halls. Her dark hair, always neatly pinned back, caught the moorland light and made her seem younger than her years. Behind her calm composure, however, lay a restless spirit, a curiosity that sometimes clashed with the village's conservative traditions. In their tidy cottage, Elena tended her household with the same precision Thomas applied to the post office. Yet her true passion lay in the village library's dusty corners, poring over tattered volumes of Yorkshire lore. She cultivated a garden of herbs and wildflowers, foxglove, yarrow and rue, that had once been staple remedies, now whispered of old-world customs no one dared discuss aloud. When neighbours questioned her botanical pursuits, she would only smile and declare, "I like to keep the old ways alive," never revealing which secrets she guarded. Their daughter, Margaret Rose, was the school's standout pupil. At 12, she carried herself with a solemn maturity, her dark curls and steady gaze mirroring her mother's resolve. Teachers admired her devotion to books on history and mythology, and after classes she would slip into the churchyard to copy faded epitaphs into a battered notebook, an unsettling hobby that hinted at a mind always searching for hidden stories. 8-year-old Will, Liam Thomas, Billy to everyone, balanced his sister's seriousness with boundless charm. His laughter rang out through the lanes as he chased village dogs and peppered adults with questions about the church's carved gargoyles and stained glass saints. He filled sketchbooks with meticulous drawings of stone grotesques and swirling autumn mist. But as October wore on, those images grew darker, filled with shadowy figures no child should imagine. Ashworth itself moved to rhythms older than memory. Every Thursday, market day transformed the church square from silent stone into a bustle of stallholders, once arriving by horse and cart, now unloading crates from rumbling motorcars. Yet despite cars and telegrams, the village still felt perched on the edge of another age, where every ancient ritual and whispered legend held the power to change a life, and perhaps condemn one. The Shepherd's Rest pub acted as Ashworth's hidden nerve centre, an unassuming tavern where every whisper of scandal or rumour found its wings. Just across the cobblestone square, the post office doubled as the village's lone general store, and nearby the schoolhouse taught children from age 5 until 14 when they were dispatched to horses for their final lessons. Yet beneath this pastoral calm lay secrets older than the churchyard stones. Ashworth was as much a fortress of tradition as it was a farming hamlet. Its founding clans, the Whitlocks, the Carrs, the Thorntons and a handful of others, bound by blood and ancient observances hidden from outsiders. Generations intermarried to preserve arcane knowledge, passing it down only through selected bloodlines. At the heart of it all stood Mrs. Margaret Thornton, the village librarian and unofficial keeper of Ashworth's unspoken laws. In her cramped, book-lined cottage rested tomes the church once banned, centuries-old manuscripts bristling with forbidden rites. Petite and bird-like in her 70s, she spoke in hushed tones, knowing every resident's affairs before they dared to speak them. Dr. Edmund Carr, another scion of those old families, returned at 55 from Edinburgh with modern medicine and his grandmother's folk remedies in equal measure. His patient registers recorded not only fevers and fractures, but what he called spiritual well-being, though he never defined precisely what that entailed. Sergeant Robert Henley, the only authority not born of Ashworth's bloodlines, had arrived 5 years earlier, determined to master every inch of his beat. But Ashworth's closed circles and unspoken pacts frustrated his every inquiry, fueling a quiet rage as relentless as the moorland wind. Overseeing them all was Reverend Harold Whitmore, who had shepherded St. Mary's for 23 years after arriving fresh from theological college. His sermons soothed the faithful each Sunday, yet behind his kindly gaze lay the vigilance of a man sworn to protect secrets that would chill any curious soul. Over decades, Reverend Harold Whitmore had shifted from a zealous church reformer into a man cloaked in unsettling mystery. His rectory study brimmed with ancient manuscripts, dusty relics and forbidden texts far removed from Anglican orthodoxy. tall and gaunt, with prematurely silvered hair and steel-grey eyes that seemed to look through people. His sermons grew more arcane each year, laced with references to forgotten truths and hidden rites that left many parishioners uneasy. Yet the village's old clans alone seemed to decipher his cryptic allusions, keeping him firmly in their thrall. As October waned, subtle shifts in the Higgins household set tongues wagging. Elena began vanishing into the churchyard at dusk, Thomas grew distant and preoccupied, and Margaret and Billy fell unnaturally quiet at play. What began as whispers quickly became open concern. Mrs. Agnes Petton, whose garden shared a wall with the Higgins cottage, was first to witness Elena's midnight rituals, slipping among gravestones with bundles of herbs, petals, and other items she couldn't name by moonlight. When pressed, Elena only smiled and murmured, "I'm honoring the old observances, Mrs. Petton." The words sent a chill through Mrs. Petton, who thereafter kept her curtains drawn each night. Meanwhile, Mr. Arthur Finch at the general store watched in bewilderment as Elena stocked up on pounds of coarse salt, dozens of white candles, and rare herbs from Mrs. Weatherby's secret garden. "Harvest rites," Elena explained, yet Finch felt only unease. Something ancient and forbidden was stirring in Ashworth, and its pulse beat strongest beneath the autumn moon. Though Elena's explanation rang hollow, after all, the Higginses had never kept more than a few kitchen herbs. Her sudden stockpiling of coarse salt, dozens of white candles, and obscure botanicals hinted at something far more ritual than domestic. Mr. Finch, ever courteous, nodded and let her purchases go unremarked, though each transaction left him with a knot of unease in his gut. Inside the schoolhouse, Miss Sarah Collins watched in growing alarm as October wore on. Margaret, once the epitome of focus, drifted through lessons with distant eyes, her pen scratching essays brimming with half-glimpsed legends and cryptic aphorisms no 12-year-old should know. Billy, usually the heart of every playground chase, retreated into his sketchbook, filling page after page with hooded figures gathered around an altar scored with unknown symbols, images that made her fingers tremble. When pressed, he only whispered, "Mommy and Mr. Whitmore showed me the old church ways." Worried, Miss Collins called Thomas Higgins in for a mid-October meeting. He arrived flushed and evasive, admitting only that Elena had joined a historical research group led by Reverend Whitmore and other villagers. He insisted it was purely academic, and yet his voice cracked and his eyes darted to the window as if expecting to see dark shapes lurking there. That society had begun innocently enough in 1962 when Reverend Whitmore proposed a gathering to uncover the pre-Christian customs woven into Yorkshire's soul. 5 charter members met monthly in the church vestry under the name Ashworth Historical Preservation Society. Whitmore himself, Mrs. Margaret Thornton the librarian, Dr. Edmund Carr, blending modern medicine with ancestral healing, Mrs. Dorothy Weatherby, the village herbalist, and James Crawford, a retired London schoolmaster turned amateur archaeologist. Their stated aim was a comprehensive study of local folklore for posterity, but behind closed doors they delved into rites long erased from parish records. Elena Higgins accepted their invitation in spring 1964, drawn by her voracious appetite for ancient lore and whispered promises of secrets no village guidebook dared mention. Encouraged by Reverend Whitmore, who praised her meticulous notes on sacred sites, she plunged headfirst into rituals and manuscripts that would soon blur the line between scholarly inquiry and something far darker. Elena threw herself into the Ashworth Historical Preservation Society with zeal, her deep knowledge of herbal lore and seasonal rites earning the respect of every member. What the village didn't know was how far beyond mere scholarship the group had drifted. By 1963, under Reverend Whitmore's direction, their study sessions had given way to hands-on enactments of that forbidden law. At first, the demonstration seemed harmless enough. Autumn harvest festivals, age-old methods of brewing herbal salves, and guided meditations claimed to echo Celtic rituals. But the vicar insisted that true understanding demanded full immersion. He argued that the medieval church had buried life-giving spiritual teachings, and that reclaiming these rites was both an academic duty and a sacred calling. By the time Elena joined, the society met twice a month, with special ceremonies on dates drawn from what Reverend Whitmore called the Old Calendar. These gatherings occurred in a hidden chamber beneath St. Mary's, an ancient room the vicar claimed he'd unearthed during renovations. He told them it was a direct link to their ancestors' practices, a place where the past still breathed. Elena's fervor impressed everyone, but her proposal to involve whole families in key rituals marked the society's turning point. She reminded them that many ancient ceremonies were built around kinship circles, and that leaving out family members risked leaving rites incomplete with unknown, even dangerous, consequences. From that night on, the line between study and ritual blurred, and Ashworth's darkest traditions began to stir once more. Thomas Higgins had been wary of his wife's new pastime, but each time Elena returned from an Ashworth Historical Preservation Society meeting, her eyes shone with excitement. She would recount forgotten customs and ancient lore that even Thomas's practical mind found fascinating. When she suggested he join a lecture, he agreed, assuming it would be purely academic. In June 1964, he sat in the vestry as Reverend Whitmore delivered a talk on medieval farming tools. Old parchments and faded field maps lay spread on the table. Thomas was intrigued by the techniques his ancestors once used. For one evening, the society seemed harmless. But over the following months, Elena's passion darkened. She began denouncing modern worship as shallow, claiming the old rites held truths the church had buried. She worked late into the night on obscure manuscripts and rose before dawn to mix strange concoctions. Her garden bloomed with herbs of unknown purpose. Most alarming, she insisted that Margaret and Billy learn the proper ways of their forebears, teaching them chants and symbols she refused to explain to Thomas. Margaret's schoolwork shifted from neat essays to cryptic passages about hidden powers. Billy's sketchbook overflowed with hooded figures and altar stones. They shared whispered secrets at home, glancing at their father as though he were an outsider. By September 1965, Thomas could no longer ignore the changes. He sought out Reverend Whitmore in his cluttered study, walls lined with dusty tomes and relics. Thomas described Elena's growing obsession and the children's odd behavior. He braced for advice to limit her involvement. Instead, the vicar leaned forward and spoke of ancient duties placed on certain families, rituals that must continue or risk dire consequences. A subtle threat hung in his words. "Stop at your peril." Thomas left feeling more unsettled than ever. In October, the society's gatherings increased, and Elena's preparations grew furtive. The children's knowledge surpassed their years, and their eyes held a secret Thomas couldn't breach. He visited Dr. Carr 3 times that month, nerves frayed, haunted by sleepless nights and dread he couldn't name. On October 25th, Thomas returned to Dr. Carr nearly broken. He spoke of obligations that once begun could never end, and asked if there was a cure for religious mania, fear choking his voice. He knew something was stirring beneath St. Mary's, and he feared the darkness would consume his family. What happened next would become the greatest mystery Ashworth had ever known, one sealed behind the ancient stones of St. Mary's, and whispered only in shadows. Most disturbing of all, Thomas confessed to Dr. Carr that he feared a lingering evil in places stained by past horrors. When pressed, he revealed Elena's secret excursions into sealed corners of St. Mary's, areas no parishioner had ever entered, where she claimed to receive whisperings from beyond the everyday world. Dr. Carr urged Thomas to share the concerns with Reverend Whitmore, advice he would soon regret. What the doctor did not know was that the vicar himself was the architect of the Higgins family's undoing. In the final week of October, every neighbor noted a palpable shift in the household. Elena vanished from village gatherings, seen only in the church's gloom at odd hours. Margaret and Billy shrank from their friends, pale faces drained of color. Thomas, once unerringly punctual at the post office, missed days of work, his nerves frayed by nameless dread. Late at night, Mrs. Peaton heard unearthly sounds from the Higgins cottage, low, rhythmic chanting, the harsh crackle of burned herbs sending acrid smoke into the moonlit yard, hushed voices vibrating with fierce emotion. Shadowy figures draped in dark cloaks slipped through the gate after dusk, moving with predatory silence and never lingering beyond an hour. Sunday, October 31st, 1965, dawned under an iron sky, fog so thick it swallowed St. Mary's Tower. The Higgins family filed into their usual third-row pews as Reverend Whitmore preached on ancient covenants enduring through time. Elena's brow furrowed in intense focus as she scribbled in a leather-bound journal, her first-ever sermon notes. Thomas sat rigid, pallid, fists clenched. Margaret and Billy sat so still they seemed carved from stone. The sermon took on an uncanny edge, invoking obligations older than memory and warning of ceremonies that must be completed lest dire consequences follow, phrases none but a select few could decode. When service ended, the Higginses moved home at a swift, urgent pace, ignoring Mrs. Peaton's friendly wave as though they walked a final path. Mr. Finch saw them lock their door at 2:30 p.m., then vanish from view. By nightfall, the cottage lay dark, an unthinkable silence for a Sunday when lights normally glowed until bedtime. Then, sometime after midnight, Mrs. Peaton awoke to a chant drifting from the churchyard. Peering through her curtains, she beheld a procession, robed figures bearing candles, weaving with solemn precision around St. Mary's stone walls. Their ceremony pulsed with a rhythm older than the village itself, terrifying in its ancient precision. As she watched, the line of hooded worshippers reached the church's base and simply dissolved into the mist, as though the very stones had parted for them. The candles continued to flicker, unclaimed by mortal hands, until dawn's grey light bleached them from view. No one emerged. No door swung open. In that hour, Ashworth's darkest secret was sealed once more, buried beneath the churchyard earth and whispered only by those brave or cursed enough to remember. Shortly after midnight, Mrs. Peaton awoke to a chant that seemed torn from a fevered dream. She rose to her bedroom window and peered into the fog-laden churchyard of St. Mary's. There, in the pale glow of torchlight, a slow procession wound around the ancient stones, figures swathed in dark robes, each bearing a single flickering candle. Their movements were deliberate, rehearsed, and utterly alien to any parish ritual she had ever known. The chant pulsed in hypnotic waves for hours, never pausing, its deeper male tones laced with high, childlike voices that sent a cold knot through her stomach. As the silent marchers reached the church's base, their feet vanished into the mist, as though the very walls had opened to swallow them whole. The lights in the yard continued to dance, but no one emerged to reclaim the torches. Monday, November 1st, 1965, dawned grey and still. At 8:15 a.m., Thomas Higgins failed to unlock the post office as reliably as sunrise itself. His supple servicer, Mr. Gregory Walsh, first blamed a minor illness, until repeated phone calls to the Higgins cottage went unanswered. Concern mounting, he walked to Church Lane and tapped on the unlocked door. Inside, everything appeared untouched. Elena's purse hung by the hall, Thomas's wallet lay in its drawer, and Margaret and Billy's school clothes were neatly laid out. The cottage felt empty, not merely vacant. Within 30 minutes, Sergeant Robert Henley arrived to begin a formal inquiry. He found no sign of struggle or haste. The Sunday meal plates had been washed and put away, dishes shining in the cupboard, yet Mrs. Peaton's missing candles, Elena's folklore tomes, and the herbal brews she'd been perfecting were gone. In Thomas's study, an open Bible lay on Revelation 20. Satan bound, the dead judged. In the margin, Elena's flowing script declared, "The old covenant must be honored at all costs." Beneath it, Thomas's angular hand had scrawled, "God help us all. I fear we have gone too far to turn back." Henley spent the day tracing every whisper in Ashworth. Villagers agreed the Higginses had grown strange, withdrawn, almost haunted, but no one knew where they had gone or why they'd vanished without word. As interviews unfolded, certain townsfolk grew tight-lipped. Reverend Whitmore admitted Elena's active role in the Historical Preservation Society, yet insisted its work was purely academic. Pressed for details, the vicar's voice turned defensive. "Our records are confidential," he warned. "Your search may prove futile." He suggested, almost kindly, that the family had taken an impromptu holiday. Dr. Edmund Carr proved even more circumspect. Citing patient confidentiality, he withheld Thomas's deepest fears, only admitting the postmaster wrestled with family pressures. Sergeant Henley reminded him that missing persons inquiries override such rules, but Dr. Carr retreated, revealing nothing more. Only Mrs. Margaret Thornton, Ashworth's librarian and unspoken guardian of local law, offered a glimpse beyond polite denials. She confessed the society had delved into ancient rites, some members growing too enthusiastic, she hinted, about bringing those lost customs back to life. Her trembling voice spoke of ceremonies that kingdoms had buried and saints had denounced, suggesting that the Higgins family's fate was woven into a tapestry as old as the Dales themselves. By dusk, the search had reached an impasse. No footprints marked the dew-lashed grass, no torch embers glowed in the woodpile. Ashworth stood silent once more, its darkest secret locked behind a door no one dared open, and a mystery that would echo through its misty lanes for generations to come. The breakthrough in Sergeant Henley's investigation came from an unlikely ally. 3 days after the Higginses vanished, Miss Sarah Collins, the village schoolteacher, arrived at the station clutching a bundle of her students' work. First, the drawings by 8-year-old Billy Higgins, hooded figures encircling what looked like an underground altar, its symbols too intricate for any child's imagination. Then came Margaret's essays, 12-year-old prose woven with arcane references to ancient wisdom and lost truths that no ordinary girl should know. Armed with this evidence, Henley resolved to scour St. Mary's Church more thoroughly. He recalled oddities he'd dismissed, walls thicker than seemed necessary, odd voids behind the plaster. Measuring inside against out, he noticed gaps suggesting hidden spaces. Behind the altar, he discovered a loose stone, its edges worn by centuries of concealment. Sliding it free revealed a narrow shaft of shadow. Henley began his descent, the beam of his torch dancing over rough rock. At the bottom lay a chamber roughly 30 feet across, its walls pulsed with strange markings. Christian crosses interwoven with pagan spirals, the floor's flagstones formed a labyrinthine motif, drawing the eye toward a black stone altar at its center. That altar, carved long before the Norman masons arrived, was smeared with dark stains that sent a shiver down Henley's spine. Around it lay white wax candles, bundles of herbs and other implements that reeked of recent use. The air was heavy with incense and something metallic like blood. Scattered on the altar were personal tokens: Elena's wedding band, Thomas's pocket watch, Margaret's school ribbon, and Billy's battered toy soldier. They were arranged as offerings, not castaways, each placed with deliberate care. All at once Henley understood the terrible truth. The Higgins family had been part of this ritual. The items confirmed his darkest fear, that this chamber had claimed them. He rifled through journals piled on a stone ledge. Many dated back generations, written in cramped hands describing rites performed in this secret vault. The newest pages, in Elena's distinctive script, laid bare the Historical Preservation Society's true purpose. Not scholarship, but revival of ancestral ceremonies designed to bind something ancient and malevolent to their lives. A single passage chilled him to his core. "Tonight we complete the covenant. Through blood and promise, the old ways shall endure." Henley snapped the book shut. The candlelight flickered, as if in response. Above him the world of Ashworth carried on unaware, while below lay a conspiracy of silence and shadows, older than the village itself, and more deadly than anyone had ever dared imagine. Elena's journal entries, from her first notes in early 1964 through the final scrawl on October 30th, 1965, trace a shift from innocent scholarship into perilous obsession. At first, her pages brimmed with genuine curiosity, painstaking transcriptions of folklore, antique customs, and the lore of the Yorkshire Dales. By spring 1965, however, her tone had grown reverent, even fervent, toward what she called the old wisdom and the true faith. Entries from that season reveal the Society's slide from theory into practice. What began as academic reenactments evolved into practical restoration of long-banned rites. Elena wrote that modern Christianity had buried essential spiritual truths that only the recovery of ancient ceremonies could restore the village's protection and prosperity. Her descriptions of the hidden chamber's rites grew ever more detailed. Simple harvest festivals gave way to complex rituals she claimed dated back millennia, ceremonies performed when the veil between worlds thinned. She praised their power and beauty, glossing over any hint of danger. Most disturbing were her accounts of the harvest ceremony itself, a ritual she insisted required an unbroken family circle, performed on precise dates to maintain the community's spiritual shield. Her final entries brimmed with ecstatic fervor. Portents had appeared, she wrote, signaling that the Higgins family had been chosen to complete the covenant. The writing trembled with mania. Signs surround us. The time is come. We must fulfill our blood oath. Beneath loose stones in the chamber floor, Henley found a second journal, much older, its cracked leather binding worn by decades. Multiple handwritings filled its pages, the earliest dated to the 1920s. This hidden volume revealed that Ashworth's secret society was no new aberration, but part of a half-century conspiracy. The earliest entries belonged to Father Michael Blackwood, St. Mary's rector from 1919 until his death in 1942. He had unearthed the underground vault during repairs and initially marveled at its symbols, but over time his fascination curdled into obsession. By the mid-1920s, his notes described voices he heard in meditation, voices that dictated elaborate rites to secure the village's fate. Blackwood's ceremonies, though claimed as ancient, mirrored his own occult readings and growing paranoia. He drafted meticulous instructions, each ceremony more demanding than the last, selecting participants by ever-shifting criteria that suited his delusions. By 1928, he had gathered a core of followers, the very families later led by Reverend Whitmore, the Thorntons, the Carrs, the Weatherbys, and others. He assured them they belonged to a chosen bloodline entrusted with the old secrets. The most horrifying entries detailed what Father Blackwood called the ultimate sacrifice. Father Blackwood's surviving journals, his scrawled entries from 1919 until his death in 1942, had painted the hidden chamber as a place of promise, but by October 1930, his words turned lethal. He recorded the Morrison family's October disappearance with clinical detachment, as if noting a seasonal rite rather than a mass murder. Henley's painstaking analysis of those faded pages revealed a grim pattern. Every few years, Blackwood, and later Reverend Whitmore, chose an unsuspecting household for what they called spiritual elevation. Families freshly arrived or socially isolated were targeted so their vanishing would slip beneath notice. After the Morrisons came the Hartwells in 1933, the Spencers in 1936, the Dunbars in 1939, each made to appear as if they'd departed Ashworth of their own accord. Possessions quietly dispersed, their cottages rented, and whispers suggesting an overseas move. Blackwood's own death in 1942 briefly broke the cycle, but his successor, Harold Whitmore, picked up the mantle in 1945. Whitmore's early hidden entries brimmed with revulsion. He condemned Blackwood's violence, yet confessed to an obsessive fascination. Over months of prayer and meditation in the subterranean vault, he came to view those brutal sacrifices as divine safeguards against terrible calamities. By 1947, he had selected the Fletcher family as his first victims, refining Blackwood's crude methods with chilling psychological finesse and community misdirection. Under his direction, the Ashfords fell in 1950, the Kellys in 1953, the Bradfords in 1956, the Hawkins in 1959, and the Pattersons in 1962. Whitmore's journals detailed his grand design: recruit promising souls into the Ashworth Historical Preservation Society under the guise of folklore study. For years, members attended harmless lectures, seasonal gatherings, and standard research, activities rooted in genuine local tradition. Meanwhile, Whitmore silently assessed each person's yearning for spiritual meaning and their isolation from the wider community. Those deemed pliable were gradually introduced to esoteric rites, always touted as ancient and life-affirming. Doubters were quietly edged out, true believers advanced to more secretive ceremonies. The underground chamber itself was a masterstroke of manipulation. Whitmore exploited its echoing acoustics and the weight of centuries to unnerve newcomers. Dim lighting and chilling air induced a trance-like compliance. He imposed fasts, solitary meditations, and ritual washings designed to erode skepticism and deepen dependency on the group. By the time a family was chosen for the ultimate harvest ceremony, they no longer questioned the violence they were about to endure. They believed themselves to be the chosen guardians of ancient wisdom, their own sacrifice nothing more than the completion of a sacred covenant, a covenant that for countless generations had demanded blood in exchange for Ashworth's secret protection. Elena Higgins's journals, from her first hesitant notes in early 1964 to the final ecstatic entry on October 30th, 1965, lay bare the artful manipulation that transformed a curious mother into a zealous acolyte in just 18 months. Reverend Whitmore had carefully exploited her thirst for knowledge, her spiritual longing, and her wish to feel chosen. By autumn, Elena wasn't merely a witness. She was the society's fiercest champion, convinced that her family's harvest ceremony must be completed. Her last journal pages brimmed with rapture. She spoke of portents in the fog, of Whitmore's promise that all doubts would dissolve once the covenant was sealed. She thanked the vicar for choosing her, for granting her this sacred honor, even as she admitted worry over Thomas's hesitation, confident he would be purified during the rite itself. Whitmore's own hidden record for October 31st reads like a surgeon's log. At 11:00 p.m., Elena, Thomas, Margaret, and Billy entered the subterranean vault alongside 6 trusted members of the Historical Preservation Society: Dr. Carr, Mrs. Thornton, Mrs. Weatherby, Mr. Crawford, and 2 others Henley later identified as pillar figures in the community. The ceremony began with familiar comforts, soft chants, candlelight, and herbal draughts that lulled the family into a trance. But as the hours wore on, the wine was spiked with what Whitmore called spiritual compounds, substances that fractured Thomas's resolve and left the children lost in fevered dreams. When Thomas tried to flee, the other participants seized him. The terrified children, reeling from the drugs, could not follow. Whitmore's account of the killings is chilling in its brevity. The sacrifice followed the ancient formula. The family's bonds were broken and their spirits released. Their bodies were carried into the cavern's depth before dawn. The remains, he noted, were laid to rest in the natural caverns that had swallowed countless victims over 5 decades, caverns hidden beneath St. Mary's, at the very heart of Ashworth's faith. In the weeks after, a meticulously orchestrated cover-up fell into place. Dr. Carr drafted forged medical reports claiming a virulent fever drove the Higginses to flee. Mrs. Thornton whispered rumors of a sudden job offer that whisked Thomas away. The family's possessions vanished. Elena's books and candles repurposed among society members, herbal vials scattered or buried, even the cottage scrubbed clean before new tenants arrived, told the old inhabitants had immigrated to Canada. When Sergeant Henley finally confronted Dr. Carr with Elena's journal and Whitmore's ledger laid bare, the physician first insisted the manuscripts were mere fantasy penned by unstable minds, but faced with physical evidence from the vault and corroborating testimony from society members, he broke. In his confession, he revealed the psychological machinery behind Ashworth's century of bloodshed, how learned, rational people were gradually weaned from skepticism, drawn first by folklore lectures, then by esoteric ceremonies, and finally by the promise that true faith demanded the ultimate sacrifice. Henley's arrests would roll through Ashworth like thunder. Mrs. Thornton, Mrs. Weatherby, Mr. Crawford, and two more prominent families, all implicated. Each had believed they were shields for the village, protecting it from some nameless doom, even as they murdered their neighbors in service of a savage covenant. If this tale has sent a chill down your spine, share it with someone who loves a dark mystery. Hit like to support our channel and subscribe so you never miss an excavation of secrets buried beneath centuries of silence. Next time, we'll follow Henley as he confronts the living architects of Ashworth's horror, men and women who once seemed pillars of the community, now revealed as murderers cloaked in faith. Most disturbing of all was the revelation that this elaborate self-deception had been essential to the society's unity, ensuring members sank ever deeper without guilt or remorse. Under intense questioning, Mrs. Margaret Thornton initially insisted the Historical Preservation Society had been devoted solely to academic study. Yet when Sergeant Henley uncovered personal effects from multiple murdered families in her cottage, hearthrobes, toys, wedding tokens, she broke down and confessed her part in a decades-long conspiracy that had become woven into the very fabric of Ashworth's social and economic life. Thornton admitted that the belongings of vanished families were quietly redistributed among society members, heirlooms exchanged for loyalty, and cottages quickly rented or sold to fund their dark rites. She spoke of how families deemed disruptive or outsiders had been eliminated, their absence smoothed over by forged documents and townsfolk too fearful to question whispered explanations of emigration or sudden illness. Reverend Harold Whitmore's arrest was the most dramatic. When Henley arrived at the rectory with a warrant, he found the vicar in his study, feverishly shredding diaries and burning parchments. Whitmore's final journal entries dripped with paranoia and delusion, rants of divine mandates and ancient covenants that demanded blood. He greeted Henley with vacant eyes, muttering of spiritual obligations that only he could fulfill. At York Crown Court in spring 1966, the trial of Ashworth's conspirators gripped the nation. Prosecutors laid out a tapestry of systematic murder and communal complicity, shattering every assumption about the village's quaint piety. The backbone of the case was the hidden journals, Father Blackwood's original ledger, Whitmore's own meticulous records, and Elena's fevered scribbles, corroborated by physical evidence from the underground vault. Witness after witness, once silenced by fear and the weight of tradition, stepped forward. Some admitted to quietly disposing of a neighbor's belongings, others to feigning ignorance of anguished cries carried up from the earth. Dr. Edmund Carr's testimony proved especially devastating. He detailed how learned, rational individuals were conditioned over years to believe that ritual murder was a sacred duty that protected Ashworth from impending calamity. The trial also exposed the mercenary undercurrent beneath the pseudo-religious veneer. Each selected family had been property owners with valuable land or cottages, assets that passed seamlessly into the hands of society members upon their disappearance. Prosecutors demonstrated how victim selection hinged not only on spiritual criteria but on inheritance laws and real estate values. Margaret Thornton's testimony illuminated the social machinery that enforced conformity. Dissenters risked ostracism, economic retaliation, and vicious rumors that destroyed reputations. She confessed that any hint of objection was met with cold exclusion. No mail, no market stall, no whisper of kindness in the Shepherd's Rest. The village's gentle facade masked a brutal culture of forced complicity. Psychiatrists called to assess Reverend Whitmore concluded he suffered a delusional disorder, but emphasized that his mental breakdown did not impair his capacity to plan and execute complex crimes. His calm, calculated coordination of logistics, recruiting families, scheduling ceremonies, arranging body disposal, belied any notion of madness. His warped theology was matched by chilling efficiency. Forensic teams scoured the cave system beneath St. Mary's, unearthing the remains of 17 families, 63 souls slaughtered over 35 years. From infants to grandparents, each bore signs of methodical killing, some drugged into submission, others slain in ceremonies that borrowed archaic sacrificial motifs. The children's bones told a story of terror prolonged into the final moments they could comprehend. Investigators even traced Ashworth's dark pattern into neighboring villages, uncovering disappearances that mirrored the society's MO. It became clear that Reverend Whitmore's network was not an isolated aberration, but part of a wider underworld operating under the guise of historical preservation. When the verdicts fell, Ashworth's survivors were left to reckon with an unimaginable betrayal. Many admitted decades of silent complicity, confessing shame that would linger long after the prison doors clanged. Henley's case forced a reckoning with the ease of collective self-deception and the peril of belief untethered from conscience. If this story chilled you to the bone, share it with someone who dares to examine the darkness beneath the surface. Hit like to support our channel and subscribe for more deep dives into mysteries that refuse to remain buried. Next time, we'll follow the survivors of Ashworth as they grapple with the legacy of terror that once masqueraded as faith. That elaborate self-deception was the glue that held the society together, ensuring no one ever paused long enough to feel guilt or remorse. When Sergeant Henley confronted Mrs. Margaret Thornton, she clung to the story that their Historical Preservation Society was nothing more than a scholarly club. But hidden in her cottage were the personal treasures of vanished families, hearthrobes, children's toys, wedding tokens, proof that she had helped distribute the spoils of murder. Under the weight of that evidence, Thornton confessed how the society wove atrocities into Ashworth's social and economic fabric. Cottages were quietly rented or sold, funds siphoned off to support secret rites, and any family deemed disruptive simply ceased to exist. The vicar's own arrest eclipsed them all. Henley found Reverend Whitmore in his study, frantically burning diaries and shredding manuscripts, his mind unraveling under the strain of years of violence. He muttered of divine commands and ancient covenants, unable to reconcile the monstrous reality with his twisted theology. In the spring of 1966, York Crown Court was packed as the trial laid bare a community's darkest secret. Journal entries, the hidden vault's relics, and forensic evidence from beneath St. Mary's formed an unassailable case. Ashworth's most respected citizens had been methodical killers. Witnesses, once cowed by tradition, told of nights spent disposing of a neighbor's belongings or hearing strange chants carried up from the caves below. Dr. Edmund Carr's testimony cut deepest. He described how educated, rational people were conditioned through lectures, seasonal celebrations, and whispered promises of spiritual renewal, until brutal murder felt not just justified, but sacred. Over decades, they had convinced themselves they served a higher purpose, even as they butchered their friends and neighbors. The courtroom also heard how greed rode alongside fanaticism. Victim selection often hinged on property values and inheritance laws. Families with the most valuable land were deemed ripe for sacrifice. Thornton explained how heirlooms and assets were quietly redistributed, how a missing family's cottage would be snapped up before rumor could spread. Margaret Thornton revealed the ironclad social control that enforced silence. Dissenters were ostracized, denied market trade, and subjected to ruinous gossip. The Shepherd's Rest pub, once a place of comfort, became a gauntlet of veiled threats for anyone daring to whisper suspicions. Psychiatrists testifying for the defense conceded Reverend Whitmore suffered from severe delusions, but emphasized he planned and executed each atrocity with chilling clarity. His rituals followed precise schedules. Body disposal routes were meticulously mapped through the cavern network beneath the church. Forensic teams recovered the remains of 17 families, 63 lives snuffed out over 35 years. From infants to grandparents, each showed signs of sedatives and violent death. Children's bones bore marks of terror that spoke of awareness too late to save them. As Henley's inquiry reached beyond Ashworth, neighboring villages reported disappearances that mirrored the same pattern. Isolated families, rumors of sudden departures, and never a body found. Evidence suggested the Ashworth Circle was only one cell in a larger network of ritual murder disguised as historical research. When verdicts fell, Ashworth's survivors faced a reckoning. Dr. Carr, Mrs. Thornton, and 4 others received life sentences. Whitmore was declared guilty, but mentally ill and confined indefinitely to a secure hospital. Several villagers faced shorter terms for cover-ups and willful ignorance. The judge's words struck a delicate balance, acknowledging the profound coercion at play, yet upholding the ultimate duty to protect the innocent. Parliament moved quickly. The Church of England overhauled its oversight of rural parishes, demanding background checks for all clergy. Police protocols for missing persons investigations were rewritten to mandate thorough inquiries, even in tight-knit communities. Medical ethics boards required independent verification when whole families relocated suddenly under mysterious circumstances. Compensation funds drawn from the conspirators' seized assets paid out to surviving kin. Though many victims had no relatives beyond Ashworth, their memory lost to generations of silence. In the end, Ashworth as a community was shattered. Faith in neighbors evaporated, replaced by suspicion and grief. Many survivors struggled with nightmares, anxiety attacks, and lifelong trauma, once recognized as post-traumatic stress. Children who grew up during the conspiracy found trust almost impossible. Even the gentle rural landscape became a haunted reminder of secrets buried too deep. Ashworth's quiet lanes still show the scars of what happened here: the abandoned cottage on Church Lane, the ivy-choked mouth of the hidden entrance under St. Mary's, and the echo of footsteps that will never be heard again. If this story has sent a chill down your spine, share it with someone who loves uncovering dark truths. Hit like to support our investigations, and subscribe so you never miss a dive into history's most unsettling mysteries. Next time, join us as we explore the survivors who dared to rebuild their lives after Ashworth's final terrible revelation. Most villagers untainted by the murders chose flight over memory. Within weeks of the trial's end, Ashworth emptied. Homes once warm with children's laughter stood dark and silent. Shops shuttered and the weekly market vanished from the square. St. Mary's Church, the heart of the village for 8 centuries, was quietly deconsecrated. To Saint thrill-seekers and mournful pilgrims, authorities razed the building. They poured concrete into the hidden chamber and covered it with earth, planting grass to hide the stones beneath. Yet no amount of soil could erase what had happened. The cottages of the sacrificed lay abandoned. The very wood seemed stained by the past. The Higgins cottage, the place where the nightmare began, lingered longer than most, stubbornly standing until the early 1970s, when it was finally torn down. The school closed its doors forever as the roll fell below 10 pupils. The post office, once Thomas Higgins's domain, locked its windows for good. By 1970, fewer than 50 souls remained in what had been a thriving community of 300. Those who stayed were mostly the elderly, too old or too poor to leave, and a handful of heirs left with unsellable property. Pillars of the old village crumbled, potholes cracked the lanes, gardens ran wild, and the echo of footsteps was swallowed by weeds. Ashworth became a ghost town, a living memorial to horrors no one could truly bury. But Ashworth's legacy reached far beyond its empty lanes. Criminologists pored over the case, desperate to understand how ordinary neighbors became executioners in candlelit vaults beneath a village church. Psychologists studied the pattern of gradual indoctrination. Sociologists asked how community bonds, trust, neighborliness, shared faith, could be twisted into a pact of murder. Experts learned that mass violence can breed quietly in even the most peaceful places, given the right mix of isolation, deference to authority, and whispered promises of protection. The Ashworth conspiracy forced a reckoning. Evil does not wear a uniform or wait for war to break out. It can take root in a kindly village, nurtured by fear and secrecy. Religious leaders, too, felt the tremor. Ashworth became a cautionary tale of unchecked spiritual power, of how a trusted pastor's words can become chains that bind a community to atrocity. Seminaries revised curricula on pastoral oversight. Parishes installed new safeguards to prevent any single cleric from wielding unchecked authority. Today, when the wind moans through the derelict ruins and the grass sweeps over broken stones, Ashworth still speaks its dreadful truth, that beneath our calmest traditions, the darkest rites can flourish, and that we must never forget the price of blind faith. The most chilling truth of Ashworth isn't the blood in those hidden vaults, it's how a peaceful village was unmade from the inside. Two men of the cloth, Father Blackwood and Reverend Whitmore, twisted sacred trust into a weapon of murder. They proved that no institution is immune when power goes unchecked and piety becomes a mask for fanaticism. Their methods weren't brute force, but psychological alchemy, small lectures on local law, seasonal gatherings in candlelit chambers, whispered promises of protection, until rational, compassionate people were convinced that spilling a neighbor's blood was an act of devotion. The result was generations of secret sacrifice, each family's disappearance slipping into the soil beneath St. Mary's. Ashworth's horror teaches us that isolation, geographic and social, breeds vulnerability. When a community cuts itself off, refusing outside scrutiny, even the kindest traditions can turn lethal. And when respected leaders preach a hidden gospel, doubt becomes a crime more dangerous than heresy. This saga reminds us, never surrender critical thought to charisma. Question authority, seek voices beyond your circle, and refuse the comfort of easy answers, because the most devastating conspiracies begin not with monsters at the gate, but with ordinary people who abandon their inner compass. Could it happen here, in a village you call home, in a faith you cherish? History doesn't require grand conspiracies, only willing hearts. Share your thoughts below. Do you believe manipulation on this scale could take root in today's world? If this tale stirred your mind, subscribe and ring the bell for more dark revelations. Share with someone who needs a reminder that the most fearsome monsters often wear the gentlest faces, and that our greatest shield is the courage to ask the hardest questions.